Thank you. Good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? I hope you're all geared up with a cup of coffee, with your XO screens turned on, because this is going to be a fun session. I'm Vibhu, and co-hosting with me today is going to be Jason Connor. Um, well, just a quick word about us. Both of us are part of the customer success engineering team for Cortex XSOAR. Um, we have a few years of experience in between ourselves in terms of XOR, and we'd like to share that experience in terms of uh, how we've helped a lot of clients troubleshoot issues, what are some of the tips and tricks, and yeah, how do we actually go about troubleshooting things in XOR? Um, So quick agenda slide. Most of this was already in the webinar description, but if you didn't catch that, we're going to be talking about block bundles, about developer tools and hard files, performance exports and whatnot. So yeah, stay tuned. Just wanted to throw in a little bit about what is the kind of inspiration or motivation for this webinar. The main objective of this webinar is to help the audience with some of the resources that are available in XOR for troubleshooting. It's basically to provide a starting point for the user to triage or try to identify an issue and help scope or assess the risk. And let me give you a quick example. Let's say a user notices an integration command failing. This integration is running through an engine. However, the user notices that the engine is disconnected. So this could potentially pose a more serious risk as multiple integrations may be running on the engine. So now the focus of troubleshooting must be shifted from troubleshooting the integration itself into troubleshooting the engine disconnect. So this is the kind of, I guess, insight that we want to be taken off as like a key takeaway from this webinar. And with this understanding, we hope like you can expedite issue reproduction and resolution of issues, and yeah, help us help you. With that, gonna turn over to Jason here.
Thanks, Vibhu. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Jason Connor. I am a manager here at Palo Alto Customer Success, specifically managing the Customer Success East engineering team. And on this slide, what Vibhu and I kind of wanted to do is talk about what the differences are between common issues that clients face, and really talk about what pieces of information are extremely beneficial to the Palo Alto support team or later on to engineering if further escalation is required. So we're going to break this down into three primary areas. The first is a content issue, right? A content issue takes several forms. So first of all, integration, single sign-on, whether you're fetching, you're mirroring, if commands are not working after an update, if you need help, things like that. But it's really focused on content that is in the box that has been downloaded from the marketplace. And it could take several different forms. And also, this includes custom content, right? So custom content, as you guys know, we on the CS team, we absolutely try to help with for clients, especially when we're diagnosing issues. Some of the common things that you'll see here are like an automation that doesn't work as expected. So you may get an error or something like that. Or for example, you may have a playbook that's running slowly. We actually list that as a content issue rather than a performance issue most of the time, because very often it's one single playbook or one single incident type that is having that issue, and most often it's caused by something in the tasks or something in the investigation context that's causing a little bit of a slowdown. And then we separate that into a performance issue. Performance issue is a little bit different, and then a performance issue will generally affect the entire server, right? So you might have 10 analysts that are logged in, and you might have slowness in the UI. Each one of those analysts may experience slow searches. The UI may load slowly. You may experience some form of like maybe a WebSocket timeout or something like that, where really the entire user base of the server is affected. That's kind of how we talk about performance issues. And then the last is really platform and architecture issues. And this really comes down to how an individual client has set up XSOAR, right? So for example, you might be using remote repositories, and you might be experiencing errors during a push or a pull. You might have dev to prod set up. You might have questions on how to do dev to prod. You might be having live backup issues or things like that. Underlying database issues, whether it be Elastic or Bolt, and then engines, Docker Podman. Those are really what we relate to as platform issues. So I hope those distinctions are clear. I think VBU at this point, we did want to pause a sec for questions, because this is actually really fairly important, because next thing we're going to do is actually, we're going to talk a little bit about what we need in order to help people troubleshoot faster. So if there are any questions, we are happy to take.
Put the questions down on the Zoom chat, and we can answer those. We'll give everyone a minute to look at the slide, because there's a lot to take in. If you notice how we've put these or classified these as buckets, you'll see that there is something in the parentheses for each bucket. And those are basically the kind of issues that the kind of information that we need to troubleshoot these issues. For example, for a content issue, we'd need reproduction steps. We'd need screenshots of the integration settings if it's an integration issue, right? But if it's a performance issue where the UI is loading slowly, we'll probably need a HAR file and screen recording, because it's harder to reproduce performance issues. So yeah, just have a quick look at this, and let us know if you have questions. Okay, I think we can go ahead, because we have a lot of content to cover.
There is one question. So Iran asked, will troubleshooting suggestions work for both hosted and non-hosted instances? Sorry. So in a lot of cases, Iran, yes, absolutely. Some of the commands, especially when we get to like Docker troubleshooting or something that you have to run on the hosted side, that's something that in a hosted instance, support will do, or Palo Alto DevOps will do, right? In most cases, though, most of the things that we're going to show in this particular webinar will actually affect both. And that is really irrespective of like which platform that you deploy on. Any other questions?
I saw a question about why there was a need for video recording. I did answer that on the chat, but the reason we need a screen recording, and this is going to be before you go about opening a support ticket or try troubleshooting it or trying to see what's causing it, just to give you a way to capture what the issue was in terms of the UI. so that you can reproduce it later. Sometimes you may not be able to reproduce it, and this is why we need the screen recording, because we won't know what the issue is. Sometimes if you just point out that this was happening, and we'll ask you like, where was it happening, show us. So yeah, I think we can step through to the next slide. So yeah, this is a quick list of some of the key troubleshooting commands that we use day to day in terms of troubleshooting. So I'm going to quickly run through what each one of these is. These are so the first one is fetch from instance. So this is part of the developer tools pack. Basically, if you have an integration instance that's enabled and fetching incidents, you can try to force a fetch using this without affecting the integration's fetch. So this way you can check if there's an error in fetching, if there's a error that's being thrown by the integration, or the data that you're capturing from the fetch is, if it's not as per your expectation, you can check what data is coming in. So I feel that's a very useful command. The next one is any integration command. If let's say it's erroring out, you can run it with this option or argument called debug-mode equals true. And what that does is basically generates a log file whenever any command is run with that argument. And you can actually review the log file to see what steps or what actions the integration or automation took, and you can follow along where it might have errored out in case the error message itself is not very clear. And we can also so the debug mode equals true works on commands that have that are erroring out as well. So even if the commands are erroring out, you can still get the log. So that's a very nice addition. You can run it along with fetch from instance. If you run debug mode equals true, you can follow the entire flow of the fetch, and debug mode equals true is only available from the CLI, so you cannot specify that as an argument in a playbook task. Ping is pretty common. Let's say you're troubleshooting whether something can connect to XSOAR. You can check if XSOAR has access to that, if something's blocking it, or if the domain that you're trying to connect to is resolving or not. So this is a quick way to test. Just keep in mind though, some sites or hosts might block ping requests. So it's not a sure shot way of testing it, but nevertheless, a good way to start off. We'll talk about the demistore logs bundle command in the next slide, but this is just a quick mention of it, because this is a really good way to get the demistore logs without having to click through going through the troubleshooting page and click download logs. You can just run this command, and this becomes particularly useful in scenarios where you expect things to fail or expect things to go wrong, and you just want to grab the log bundle. Let's say when you're reproducing an issue, for example, you want to grab the log bundle immediately. So you can just include this in the playbook. This is a command that can be included in a playbook task. Note that the demistore logs bundle requires an instance of the demistore REST API to be configured, an integration instance with the API key of the instance that you want to get the logs from. Reset containers is a different kind of command, and this command basically kills off all the Docker containers forcefully and respawns them. So I would say run this with caution. It's a really nice way to troubleshoot issues that are being caused by Docker containers, but it might stop playbooks or automations or integrations that are running and for a brief period. So just make sure that you run this when you don't have anything important that is running. Failed instances is also a really cool command. It's the equivalent of going and hitting test on each integration instance. And in an automated fashion, it runs those tests and returns a result with a nice, really nice markdown, so that you know what integrations are not erroring and what integrations are erroring. So it's a really nice command. Another way to test whether integration commands are giving out all the data that you're seeing is, or you're expecting, is by using the raw dash response equals true. This is another argument. What this does is returns the raw JSON data that is being returned from that is being returned as a response for a specific API call on the integration. And many of the times you'll feel like some information is missing, or is there anything more that this command returns? So typically all of that is included in the context, but if you think that there might be more that the integration command has to return, or it's more valuable to you, you can always run this and check if it's giving anything else. The /health app servers endpoint is one of the endpoints that we use to monitor XSOAR system health. This is something that our DevOps team uses to monitor our hosted customers. And it's applicable to on-prem as well. What this returns is some information about the server, what's its status, how many workers are being used, and things like that. So usually you get a 200, your server's doing good. And you can also check what's the CPU usage and things like that. The last command I've included as kind of add-on to this slide, because it's not really a command that's used for troubleshooting, but I feel like this is a command that's very important to know. These two commands, repopulate files and delete context. So when you are, let's say, running a playbook and it didn't run as expected, and you want to rerun the playbook on the incident, it's always useful to clear the context first, because you will only have context data that's fresh from the fresh run of the playbook. It does not clear the incident object, it only clears the context keys. But one of those context keys that gets cleared is the file key. And without the file key, you may not have a file to process or file to check. So that is why we run the second command, which is repopulate files, which basically puts the file back into the context so that you can continue processing that file. With that, I think all of these commands can be pasted on the Zoom chat here for everybody's use. But yeah, feel free to ask any questions about these in the chat. So a quick word on the logs, and I'll switch over to the XSOAR screen after this. Sorry.
We have a couple questions, Vibhu, and I think some of these we may want to take live if you want to take a look at them real quick.
Oh yeah. So is it possible to execute more than one command on the CLI, like delete context and set playbook? That's unfortunately not possible. The CLI is much like your Linux terminal, where you can run one command, but there's no way to pipe commands like how you would do on a Linux terminal. So yeah, it's one command at a time. Um, and the next question is, does fetch from instance create an incident, or is it only for troubleshooting purposes? Um, Fetch from instance does not create an incident. It just returns what data that is going to be there in an incident if the incident does get created, essentially returning the incident object as the output. Um, and it is meant only for troubleshooting. Yes. Um, is reset containers similar to Docker image prune? So there is a difference between a Docker image and a Docker container. Docker image is basically kind of all the packages of that the Docker container needs. And when you run reset containers, it's basically killing off all the containers. Your images are untouched when you run that. So yeah, just wanted to mention that. So we can go to the next slide, or go back to my XOR screen. So yeah, just wanted to quickly show a demo of how you would generate the logs in XOR. So there is this playbook that we have. I'll get into it in a bit, but essentially you can have a task that errors. Let's say here you're checking like the context value of a key that does not exist, and you can check whether this previous entry errored out. If it did, it is going to create a log bundle and close the incident. So the command here that we talked earlier about was the demonstro logs bundle command. And as you see, you can generate a log bundle here. And another way to go about checking if a command errored is using the error path. That is a fairly new feature in XOR. So this is more of a legacy approach to this, but it works just as well. So
Also, if you wouldn't mind, Vibio, I'll talk about this for just a second.
yep.
So I use this very frequently with my clients, and my background, it has a lot of ops in it. One thing that I like to tell my clients is that often we will have a good suspicion of which tasks are going to error. It's often a task that might go out to a third-party application and try to fetch something, or perhaps you're going out to test something on an endpoint and that service may not be started, for example. Those are good candidates for this type of logical structure. And because we don't know exactly when that will fire, one of the difficult things that we have when clients open support cases is support will come back and say, okay, well, can we get a log bundle? A lot of clients' log bundles will roll before they notice that this has errored. So when we see these errors, we can set up this type of logical structure and download those log bundles literally seconds after the error has occurred, which is why it's so useful. When you take this, you have a log bundle which is then attached to the incident itself, which can then be downloaded, right? And then just appended to your support ticket. That way you always have those logs that are available and you're not scrounging to try to reproduce the issue.
Yep. That is definitely super useful. So let me quickly tab to my terminal. I have the log bundle that we just created downloaded. So let me grab what's inside of it. So if you look at the log bundle, there is a bunch of files, right? There are a lot of files. Some of the important ones are the server log, and I would say Docker log, which is here. And if you have any engines, those are also the logs from the engines are also pulled in here. So in XSOAR's server log, there are four levels of logging. There is info, there is debug, there is warning, and there is error. There's actually a fifth one called fatal, but you pretty much don't see that often, but you will see errors, warnings, and debug messages. So if I open the server log, for example, and you will see that these are all info entries. There is an error entry, and yeah, so if you keep scrolling down, there's going to be a lot of different there's warning here, lot of different types. So you can filter off of this by using something like grep and check for what errors you're seeing. You can even filter off based on things like specific integration instance, for example, virus total, right? And it shows all log messages related to that specific integration instance and things like that. So the other log that is pretty important is this Docker log. So this gives you an indication of what images that are currently on the server. And it also tells you what's the server architecture, what OS it's running, and things like that. And when these images were created. And the last part, I think, is the most important one, which is basically telling you what containers are currently running, how much CPU they're using, and how many process IDs or memory percentage. So if you see a container that's using a lot of memory, I would inspect what might be running for a long time. Another indication of this is, or another message that you can use to see what might be running for a long time is this uptime of each container. So that's also pretty useful, in my opinion. And then there is, let's say, file system.log. This is also something that is pretty useful because it gives you a detailed list of your XOR varlib demonstro data directory. And the most important thing, or the most well-known use of this, is to see how big files are, right? You can quickly search how big, like, let's say, an index file is, or how big a partition data file is, and so on. So yeah, a really cool way to look at that. There's a bunch of other files here. Feel free to take a look. Workers and WebSocket are something that gets tracked back in the system diagnostics. So yeah, just wanted to show that. Let me go back to the screen share for the logs. We also have something called a har file. This har file is basically the client side request response log from the browser. So yeah, so it's just talking about developer tools and har files. So there is a way to capture these HAR files from the browser. And some of the important usages of viewing developer tools is to see what requests and responses are being made. You see how the XOR REST client and server modules are talking to each other, see the payloads, see what's being sent and received. And this becomes very important in terms of troubleshooting, let's say a SAML request that's going out to the signing authority. You want to see what was sent, what was received, so that you can adjust your SAML settings or SSO settings. And also it helps validate API errors with respect to the Demisto API. You cannot see, for example, like the integration requests or requests made to the third-party tools in the developer tools, but for those you'll need the debug logs. But you can definitely see what requests are being made to the XOR server, how long, like for example, a search is taking to load and things like that. And that, let me quickly go back to my XOR screen, just show you guys how to get the HAR file. Let's open mini incident. For example, in this incident, I want to generate the HAR file, but I also want to see what happens when like a manual task is created and closed. So for that, I open my developer tools from Chrome, go into more tools and developer tools. And you see this record button. That means that the HAR file is being captured. So if it's not read, you can click it and it will start recording. So right now we are in the network tab. So we're viewing all the network requests, essentially HTTP requests. So if I click on that, you'll see there was immediately a request that was made. So let's add a completion note here and say mark as completed. You will see that with this, you can see what was sent, what was received, and what API endpoint was used. So you can literally reproduce this exact same thing without having to click. But if you just hit this endpoint up with this payload, so that's equivalent to clicking it. So pretty much everything in XOR works like this. Whatever you can do from actions on the UI, you can essentially reproduce the same behavior using the API endpoints. So it's a very good implementation of the REST API module. So yeah, if there isn't a command to do something like to force a click or something, you can always come into developer tools and try to replicate that using the data that you gather here. Now for the HAR file, so once you've got all the network traffic captured here, all you have to do is hit the export HAR. There's a download button here, and you can save that as a .har file and download that. Cool. That I'm gonna hand over back to Jason on performance exports.
I was actually just about to answer a question from the chat. So an anonymous attendee asked how to track down the problematic playbook or automation based on Docker logs. They're very long and probably a random container name. That is a very good point. And so some of these commands have to be used in conjunction with other commands. So for example, to solve the problem that you're describing, if it's an automation or an integration command, something like that you're running, if you run it with debug-mode equals true, one of the lines that is printed in the log file that is generated is which Docker container is actually being used. So if you already know which playbook or automation is having an issue, it's actually quite easy to find the Docker container. If the piece goes the other way, so let's say that you download the log bundle and you're looking at the Docker log and you notice that one particular container is having an issue, that's where we would typically go back, and unless the container name is named something that is like maybe well known to us, like maybe the container name is pretty unique. So for example, the rasterize integration in XSOAR uses a container called Tesseract. And I just happen to know that because I've seen it, a million times. Unless the container name is really unique, a lot of times what we'll do at that point is start looking through the server log. And especially when you have things in debug mode, a lot of times it's going to tell you how long something takes to execute, right? Especially if you're talking about a search or maybe certain types of commands, they'll actually tell you how long they take to execute. And in that case, we would go back and look at which commands those are running, right? But that's actually a support task. So if you find that and it doesn't have something that's maybe easy to navigate, my advice would be that's a good time to open a support ticket because you've already got the log bundle and are already looking at that. So I hope that answered your question. So performance exports. Up until now, we've been talking about things that are very general across the platform, right? A performance export is actually not general at all. Sometimes, and I know we've all experienced this, right? There's a particular type of incident, or maybe even sometimes it's just a particular incident that is having a problem, and we're working to try to understand why. A performance export is an API call that you can make that will download basically a history file of all of the states of the tasks that are in that particular incident. They'll download what the investigation context is, what the war room entries are, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually quite confusing to read. And so I wouldn't, for most clients, I wouldn't necessarily recommend like delving into it. But if you are looking at a support case where you're trying to understand like why one thing it just happens and you're not able to figure it out, in addition to the standard log bundle that you would go through that VView has already shown, it is extraordinarily helpful to go get a performance export. When you download it, it'll just be a tar gzip file, right? So it'll just be a tarball. And then inside that tarball are these 5 files. And so this is actually one that I pulled as a member of the escalation team. And I actually looked at this and I immediately saw like, okay, it's 5.1 megs in playbook.json. I happen to know that is where the record of all of the tasks and their executions go. And so I started looking for loops because of what that means is that they had a lot of task executions. That's one of the reasons why it's really helpful to give these things to support, for example, because like I'm not even a support engineer. I just lead an escalation team here. And I just looked at the size of the file and go, oh, I need to look for this, right? So it can really help drive down your mean time to resolution, can give support really critical information that they need that is just not found anywhere else. You can pull that through this API key. And I know, this is a slide, so I don't want anybody to frantically like write this down. The slides will be available. And if you need this API key, you can always reach out to me on the different Slack as well, or VB, or any of the other CSEs. We'd be happy to help you guys with this. And ooh, this is a good one. Is there a way to capture an automation name running when a Docker container fatally exits? All that gets captured in server log is something like container name exited with a status code 137. Okay, so status code 137 is a huge red herring in Docker. It's it is the root bridge telling the container that it's time for the container to leave. It's time for the container to be killed off. So you may actually see that many times under normal operations. Now, the problem that we get into is that a Docker out of memory error is also an error 137, right? So it's a really real error. It's just also Docker uses it all the time for this other thing. Is there a way to capture the automation name running a Docker container when it fatally exits? The short answer is not exactly. What I recommend is grepping with context. And if that's something that you guys would find useful, I'll certainly put that command here in the chat. But when you grep with context around that fatal error, what it does is it shows, let's say, a certain number of lines before and after the thing that you've grepped for, right? And often when the container is exiting, in that case, I'm going to say usually, not always, right? Usually it's immediately preceding the process. So typically a 137 error is because the Docker container has exceeded the memory limit. And typically what we'll see is something right before that has done either a large search, it's loaded something very large into context, it's done some kind of big file operation, or something somewhere has loaded quite a bit into memory. That is another great case for a support case, and that's one where if you can point that error out, your support engineer can actually give you a server key that will help you troubleshoot that much quicker, right? So I hope that answered that question. I will go back and get that Docker grep with context so that everybody has it.
Cool. Thanks, Jason. And going to the next slide. I think we've touched upon this a little bit in all of our slides, but I wanted to put all the things that we are talking about in one slide in terms of what is expected and what is usually the preferred approach when troubleshooting an issue. So first questions that you want to ask yourselves when you run into any issue in XSOAR is, what were the changes that were made recently that would affect this issue? And one of the places where you can find these changes that were made is in the audit log. And the audit log is under the users and roles tab in XSOAR. And what it highlights is it gives context in terms of an object, an action, a user, and a timestamp. So you can see what object was edited, deleted, created by which user at what time, right? It may not give you the full detail in terms of what the exact modification was, but you know that something was modified at this given timestamp. So let's say a playbook was working fine, and then after a few days, you see an error in the playbook. So the first place I would go and look is the audit log to see if there was a change made to the playbook. And the next step would obviously be to revert the playbook version in the playbook version settings and see if that works, right? So this is why it's important to save your playbooks as version when you're making changes. And another place that you can see whether kind of downgrading to a lower version is the marketplace. So let's say you were using an out-of-the-box pack, and as soon as you update the pack, you see that you're running into an error. So what you can do is check what version of the pack you're on. If you're on the newest version and you're seeing the error right after upgrading or updating the pack, then you can downgrade the pack. And if you are on the older version, chances are that the error that you're seeing is already fixed in a newer version of the pack, so you can update it. So either way, looking at the pack version really helps. And one of the important things, and I'm going to stop here for a bit to share how you would go about looking at the pack version. So let's say you have the EWS pack. I'm going to say it's installed. So you can always look at the version history here for the pack to see what changes were made, right? There was a reply mail command, for example, that was added on August 23rd. So if you're seeing an issue after upgrading, updating to this, you can always hit revert to this version and it will revert to the previous version of the pack. So you can hit downgrade and it's as simple as that. So that's one thing that I wanted to showcase. Another quick question that you need to ask is, does it work differently in a playbook versus an automation? For example, if you have a playbook task that works completely fine on when you're running it as part of the playbook, and does not work when you're running it from the CLI or from an automation, or vice versa, right? It works one way but not the other way. You need to ask yourself, what are the inputs and that it is expecting when you're running from the CLI, and what it is expecting when you're running from the playbook. Maybe if you're running from the CLI, it doesn't have the context of the incident object. Maybe it does not have the playbook inputs. And vice versa would be if you're running it from the playbook, it might be running on all instances and not just on one instance. So that way you can go in and fill in the using parameter and make sure that it runs on just the one instance. And here again, the debug mode equals true is really helpful, because you know what the flow of execution is, and you can capture that in the debug logs. Another important question to ask, and to add to what Jason was mentioning about performance logs, is, does it happen every time or only occasionally? Does it happen on all incidents or only on one incident? And if it is happening on just the one incident, performance logs are the way to go, because there is clearly something that's different with that incident that's causing issues, right? It might be a huge output, it might be a huge file, it might be a lot of indicators that are being extracted and causing slowness. So things like that. And obviously, from a sanity check perspective, you want to you want to make sure that if something works on dev, if it should work on prod, should always have the same version as dev on production. And this is also important because you might have used some features on dev. Let's say we were talking about the error path, right? That was a new feature that was introduced in 6.8, I believe. And if that feature is in the playbook in dev and your prod is running on an older version, obviously that's going to cause issues, right? So always make sure that you are on a like-for-like version between dev and prod. And lastly, in terms of trying to reproduce the issue, it's not always possible, I know. And our support team will try to help you reproduce it if you cannot. And we'll always do a little bit of our own reproduction in our instances when a client runs into an issue. So we try as much to reproduce it so that we can narrow down on what the root cause is. So the point of asking all of these questions is to identify what's causing the problem and to narrow down on it. It's like an investigation on something that's occurred, and you want to grab onto all the breadcrumbs that are left behind, and these questions help you or lead you to those breadcrumbs. Anything you wanted to add to that, Jason?
Yeah, just a bonus one actually, since we've still got a couple of minutes. One thing, I work with a lot of clients who use engines, and one thing that I always recommend is if you're experiencing a problem with something that is running on an engine, and that engine happens to be in a load balancing group, break the load balancing group, make it run on a single engine, switch back and forth, right? And really, when we ask these questions, what we're ultimately trying to do is further isolate the issue into where it is that we need to look. And so our hope is to really help folks get there a little bit faster, because these are all the questions I'm sure you guys have all had, this experience of, these are all the questions that support asks when they come back to you. And by asking these questions up front, we can really narrow down the MTTR, mean time to remediate, right? So just a little bonus one. Other than that, no further comments.
Right, thank you. So with that, I think we're almost at the end of the webinar. The whole point of this webinar is not to discourage you from opening support tickets and trying to fix the issue yourselves. In fact, it's the opposite. We want you guys to open support tickets and provide as much information as possible. And the reason that we wanted to have this webinar in the first place, I talked about this in the objectives slide, is we want to give everyone a starting point and to give the context from how we see issues and what information is needed to troubleshoot the issues from our side of the house, right? And we want to give you all the necessary ammo to demand root cause analysis for these issues if you provide all of this information right away. So there is, as Jason said, lesser time to remediate, and we can give you a more accurate and quicker RCA. There is one thing that I wanted to mention. There was a webinar that was done on system diagnostics. And we'll paste the link to that webinar on the live community page as well. But take a look at that, because system diagnostics, the page can really help you understand what's not normal and what's expected from your XOR instance. And it can really start good conversations with your CS team about what you can do in terms of optimizing your XOR performance. Another heads up is always stay updated if you can. Try to update your packs, your XOR versions, because we receive a ton of support tickets from clients like yourselves, and when we fix those, we want those changes to be carried over to all the other clients as soon as possible. And the way to do that is for you guys to stay updated. And yeah, help us help you. We are always welcoming conversations about your issues. We want to suggest workarounds. We want to help as much as we can to fix those issues, to expedite the issue resolution. So yeah, help us help you again. With that, I think
We have one last question that came in.
Yes. What's the recommended frequency for updating integrations? Seems a new update comes every 2 weeks at times. Yes. The earlier legacy content update frequency was every 2 weeks, about 15 days once. But now we have a more dynamic CI/CD pipeline for pushing changes to content packs and to the marketplace. So you might see those packs receiving updates even like 2 or 3 times a week sometimes. So I would say you can run a job every week. I think that's a good frequency to keep your packs updated. And yeah, I think there's an automated way to do that, so you don't have to manually click through and select all the packs. You can talk to one of us or the CS team that you currently work with to get that automated update script. And with that, I think we can wrap up. We're almost at the top of the hour. So thanks everybody for joining in. There is a survey at the end of the webinar. Please give your feedback. We want to improve your experience. And yeah, everyone have a nice weekend and appreciate you joining in.
Absolutely. Thank you all very much and really appreciate the questions during the session. You guys had some great questions. We're happy to answer those. You guys take care.